I would like to start by welcoming everyone to this morning's session. Bonjour, good morning, salam. My name is Vrinda Narain. I'm an associate professor at McGill University's Faculty of Law and a member of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. Together with the Transnational Solidarity Network Women Living Under Muslim Laws, or WLUML, we are pleased to welcome you to our webinar centering women negotiating peace uh, in Afghanistan. Uh, the second in a series of 4 webinars, which form an integral part of WLUM's campaign, No Peace Without Women's Rights in Afghanistan, to support women's demands for meaningful participation in the peace process. This campaign is aimed at supporting the work of women in Afghanistan and bringing awareness of the issues implicated. It highlights the political contingency of rights, the fragility of freedom, and the precarity of peace. This campaign speaks to our common humanity and underscores the important work of human rights defenders as they contribute to peace, justice, and democracy and speak truth to power. I take this opportunity to say a few words about the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. It is a focal point for innovative legal and interdisciplinary research, dialogue, and outreach on issues of human rights and legal pluralism. The center's mission is to provide students, professors, and indeed the wider community with the locus of intellectual and physical resources for engaging critically with law's impact on some of the compelling issues of our times. Women Living Under Muslim Laws is a transnational feminist solidarity network that promotes human rights and gender justice and equality for people whose lives are shaped, conditioned, or governed by patriarchal and or authoritarian interpretations of Islam. WLUML recognizes that women's struggles are interconnected and complementary, and therefore has a commitment to transnational solidarity and the promotion of human rights both within and outside Muslim contexts. WLUML promotes plural democracy and actively endorses plurality and autonomy, recognizing and valuing a diversity of opinions. We are honored to have with us today 3 eminent speakers: Ms. Ghizaal Haress, Ombudsperson for the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and Professor, American University of Afghanistan; Ms. Palwasha Kakar, Director, Religion and Inclusive Societies Program at the United States Institute of Peace; and Mr. Hamid Saburi, a constitutional expert and human rights advocate. Professor Homa, Hoodfar Emerita of Concordia University and a WLUML board member, will offer opening remarks after my short introductions, and we'll be posting the bios of our distinguished guests in the chat. Very briefly, though, I would like to introduce them because they have honored us by participating in our webinar. Ghizaal Haress is currently the Ombudsperson for Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the first woman to ever lead an anti-corruption institution in Afghanistan. The Office of the Ombudsperson is mandated to inspect allegations of corruption for high governmental officials. Prior to that, she was a commissioner at the Afghanistan Independent Commission for overseeing the implementation of the Constitution, where she, as the only female commissioner, led the institution's work on constitutional interpretation and developing legal opinions. A constitutional lawyer, she has published articles on the Afghan Constitution, and she has earned her LLM from SOAS University of London and LLB from Kabul University. Next, I introduce Mr. Hamid Saburi, an independent researcher on constitutional law and human rights advocate. Formerly, he was a visiting lecturer in constitutional and international law at Kardan University in Kabul, where he previously served as the dean of the law faculty. Prior to this, he served as a country director for the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development, a Canadian NGO, and an acting director of strategic communication at the Office of the National Security Council in Afghanistan. He's also worked for various organizations, including the Harvard Program for Conflict Research, International Development Law Organization, and the Max Planck Institute for Foreign and Private International Law. Mr. Saburi holds a BA in law from Kabul University and an MA in Near Eastern Studies from NYU, as well as an MA in International Relations from Syracuse. Finally, I would like to introduce Ms. Palwasha Kakar, an Afghan American. Palwasha Kakar is the interim director of the Religion and Inclusive Societies Program at the United States Institute of Peace. She joined USIP after 4 years with the Asia Foundation, where she was the Afghanistan Director for Women's Empowerment and Development. Prior to joining the foundation, Ms. Kakar led the Gender Mainstreaming and Civil Society Unit in the UNDP's Afghanistan Subnational Governance Program. Ms. Kakar has published widely regarding women's participation in local governance, Pashtunwali Afghan customary law, Afghan women's identity, and social spaces in Afghanistan. She holds a master's degree from Harvard University's Divinity School and a bachelor's degree in religion and global studies from Bethel College in Kansas. Without further ado, I hand the floor to Professor Hoodfar to say a few words about the campaign. But before I do that, just a few housekeeping notes. I would request you to keep your mics muted just in case there's any inadvertent disturbance to our speakers. At the end of the session, the speakers will each speak for 10 to 12 minutes, after which we will be taking questions in the chat. So this will be a moderated Q&A. I will be the moderator. So please, as you're listening and questions occur to you, note them down in the chat and I will read them from the chat to our speakers. So thank you very much. And I pass to Homa now.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to talk a little bit and just introduce the campaign, but also our relationship with Afghan women's movement. WLUML has been involved with Afghan women's movement from very early on because anti-militarization was very much a major principle of women living under Muslim law, because history has shown that militarization and war is always women are the main losers, whether they are on the side of the winner or losers. So that has been a principle, and we have been working with Afghan refugees in Pakistan, especially since 1986. That is almost the beginning of the inception of women living under Muslim law. And later on, I basically managed to work with Afghan refugees from 1994 onward, both in Iran and Pakistan. And Iran and Pakistan at the time had 8 million refugees. It's slightly up and down since then. So we were very much, when the Taliban came to power, we were very much part of the campaign to show the atrocities and human rights abuses of the Taliban during that time. We especially campaigned that international governments do not recognize Taliban as a legitimate government because the oil companies are very eager to have them recognized so that they can have the contract. So that was a major thing. After the fall of the Taliban, of course, we were very involved in the constitution. Basically, had workshops with the Afghan women on the constitution. But one of the major things we did at the time was, because there was by then by 2002 there were 20 years of war in Afghanistan. During that time, lots of things had changed in relation, especially to women's rights in the world. So what we did, we invited a lot of the women's movement leaders from the Muslim majority country to come and visit Afghanistan, to meet with Afghan leaders. And after that, we also invited a lot of the Afghan women leaders to go to visit the different Muslim majority countries, how the parliament works, what are the laws, what rights they have had. Because one of the major way that in all of the Muslim majority countries they deny rights to women is in the name of religion. We wanted for Afghan women to see themselves that in fact Muslim women live their lives and they are very differently in very different countries, and they enjoy rights that are very different, maybe different from one country to another. In other words, Islam can be lived very differently. So there's that perception that always Taliban insists in presenting was not true. So that was a major thing. After that, we have worked with violence is not our culture, and no violence in terms in the name of religion and in the name of religion and culture. So Afghan women were very involved, part of the network. So And of course, then when the agreement came between the Taliban and the United States, it was an uproar uh, because of the way it excluded all the other stakeholders in the country, including the legitimate government of Afghanistan. So we decided to to launch a campaign to talk with Afghan women to see how we can support what are the aspects they see as a very important side of this campaign. Um, by mid-June, unfortunately, the pandemic happened in March, so that we had to reorganize. What we did is we did several meetings with Afghan women's leaders, and in June we launched the campaign. The campaign "No Peace Without Women's Rights in Afghanistan" is meant to support Afghan women and also to support the Afghan women's gain during the last 20 years, and the fact that we Afghan women do not want to give any rights of the constitution that they have had in the constitution to be revised and subject to that, and also international treaties and conventions that have been signed to in Afghanistan, especially violence, elimination of violence against women, and CEDAW, now to be recognized, and that human rights issues to be observed in the court, but in the law, but also culturally. So those are the major issues. Of course, there are other important demands that the campaign has, which is part of the demands of Afghan women generally. But these are the most important things. I know we don't have time for me to go to a lot of details, but a lot of things I hope to come up in the discussion. But it is very important that we recognize that what happens, the position of WLUM in this position is this is not just a question of Afghan women. In fact, if Taliban win their way and they impose their interpretation of religion, it will impact women's lives in all of the Muslim majority countries, especially, but also in minority community. And it has implication for women's rights everywhere, because that means women's rights are always up for a negotiation by various groups. So this is the main position that we have. So we don't see this, even though Afghan women are of course on front line, it doesn't mean that the issue is not just Afghan women, but is an issue for women in a Muslim context, but also for women worldwide. So that's why we are very much engaged in this campaign. I think I stop here and let our speakers to tell us more about major concerns.
So I'll invite Mr. Hamid Saburi, please. The virtual floor is yours, sir.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a very critical time to discuss the issue of women's right now because of what's really happening in the country, and also the constitutional perspective to a women's right, because it's something that's going to be one way or another affected by the political developments, which has always been an issue. Women rights has always been the centerpiece of political development and legal reforms in Afghanistan. But before going specifically talking about the articles of the 2004 Constitution, let me just go quickly back and let the audience know that when it comes to equality and women's rights and the Afghan Constitution, it goes back all the way to the 1923, when the first Constitution of Afghanistan was promulgated. So this is where we had with the provision of the Constitution was basically given equal rights to the Afghan citizens, including women. So it's not something, a phenomenon that's basically started 20 years ago. And that tradition of providing equal right through Afghan Constitution continued throughout that century, and with the exception of the the years between 1992 and 2001, where we had the civil war in 1992, and then we had the Taliban regime capturing Kabul in 1996. And for 5 years, this was an entirely different situation where while we didn't have any constitution at all during those years, the women's rights were significantly violated and undermined during those years. So this, by giving that background, we have to know that the huge part of the previous century where Afghanistan went through constitutional reform, the rights of women was mostly guaranteed in the constitutional provisions, the various constitutions that we have, because our constitution went through a lot of reforms and changes through that century. But now in 2000, what's different in the constitution of 2024, there are a number of elements, a number of provisions that guarantees and differentiates that constitution from its previous from the previous constitution. I think what is important is the first and the most important is the chapter 2 of the Afghan constitution, where it talks about all rights for us, including the equal rights for men and women, rights for education and protecting their human rights, guaranteeing their access to healthcare, and all those are enshrined in the constitution. But also, what's important is the political aspect of it. A lot of people who look at the constitution of Afghanistan see it as significant development, which it is indeed. But the reality is, we already had this, with the exception of the disruption that we had between for nine years, 1992 and 2001. Also, what's really significant in the constitution of 2004, which is different than the constitution of other neighboring countries, for example, Iran, and also to some extent, if you look at the constitution of Morocco, where, for example, in Afghan constitution, Article 84 and 83, where we are talking about the parliament or the Afghanistan National Assembly, there is specific provisions where it provides women with a specific number encoded that should be in the Afghan parliament. For example, in the upper house of the National Assembly, where there has 102 members, and out of the 102 members, 34 are to be elected by the government, and 50% of those who are supposed to be elected by the president, 50% are to be women, which I think is there's a significant development we see here from a legal point of view, and I'll come to the political aspect of it. Also, when it comes to the lower house, which is pretty important, there is a minimum quota of 2 women to be in the Afghan parliament from each province. So we have to run 34 provinces. So the minimum number of women that should be represented from each province has to be 2, and they have to be in the lower house. I think these are some of the significant developments and articles related to the to women in the Afghan constitution. But it's also like a double-edged sword. When I say it's a double-edged sword, means well, politically and legally, it's something really interesting. We see a development in a country where just a couple of years before it was promulgated, women were totally absent from the political and social structures by all means. But then suddenly there's a big jump, and then we see significant number of women participating in the political life and the social life and all aspects of the Afghan society. But when I say that it's also in another way, we are putting a cap when we're talking about only 50% of the 30 of the of 102 people and 50% of 35 representative to be selected by the president has to be women. We're basically only bringing the number to let's say 17 out of 102. So this is not really defined that the 50% are equal right when we're talking about equality. And also it's just when we are talking about 2 women per each province. In a way, it guarantees a minimum for women, but at the same time, it also a lot of people see it as a well. We have the constitution defined that there should be 2 women in the lower house of the Afghan parliament. So let's stay with that. And it's also discouraging in many ways because people, particularly those women who could but has the potential to run for the for the parliament, especially for the lower house, they wouldn't get the opportunity, and because they would think that, and a lot of them, they were thinking based on the experience that we had, that there is a quota for 2 people, 2 women to be in the lower house. So is it really worth it to run for it? So I think from a political point of view, I think while it is seen as a significant achievement, but I believe, and I think there's also a significant number of experts believe that maybe this should have been more open and open in terms of not just a quota of 2 people per province, or let's say 50% of the very small number, but also as it's in Article 22, that it has to be equal, not just like a specific number that you will confine the women participation and the most important political institutions in Afghanistan. And we see the effects of it. I mean, we have been, and if we come to what's happening recently, and it's related to what's going on at the Moscow conference, if we have seen it, and the certain and the Doha meetings that we have seen, there has been an underrepresentation of women, and partly it stems from the political developments and also the fact that there hasn't been many women politically active, and or they were sort of not included in the process, and also the reason because it has been used as a political tool. And I think the latter is more significant when it comes to Afghanistan context, because if we look at in the past at least 20 years, while there has been a significant increase in a number of women, right now there is 27% of parliamentarians, they are women. There are 6,000 women in our security forces, and there are around 160,000 working in the civil service. Still, we see that number does not reflect the women participation in major political developments that are happening in Afghanistan. Doha, Moscow were 2 major examples that we have to look into it and see how women are underrepresented. And this is basically what we're afraid of. What's going to happen once there is a settlement, and how the constitutional right of women would be affected as soon as there is a settlement between the Afghan government and the Taliban, and how that will translate into the actual life of the Afghan women. So I think there is more to discuss, but I will stop here. And if there are more questions, we can go more into details of the Afghan constitution and talk about those. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hamid. Those are very interesting aspects of the constitution and the institutional structures. Please hold on to your questions, and we'll pass now to Ms. Ghizaal Haress, please.
Thank you, Vrinda. Distinguished co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it's a true pleasure for me to be part of this panel discussion today and to talk about women in the Constitution of Afghanistan. I would like to first thank McGill Centre for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism and Women Living Under Muslim Law for organizing this important and very timely discussion. Talking about the Constitution and women's rights, and particularly at a situation that we are in right now, requires so much time. But of course, I'll try to be brief and talk within the limits of the time I've been given. So to talk about the Constitution of 2004, when it was enacted, the enactment of the Constitution in itself was a significant break from Afghanistan's past, from the decades of war and lawlessness that had affected the country at large, but in particular had affected women's rights in Afghanistan. And when you look at the Constitution of Afghanistan, of course, since the adoption, there has been a lot of challenges in terms of its implementation, but not to forget that Afghanistan has been a country in conflict and not a post-conflict country as it is usually termed. We are actually in the middle of a conflict. And despite those challenges, I think it may not be exaggeration to say we have had notable progress on many areas, rule of law, democratic governance, human rights, and particularly on women's rights. When it comes to the Constitution of 2004, it is not one of, but it is the greatest constitution Afghanistan has ever experienced. The Constitution was approved following a very inclusive process. And in the making of the Constitution, in the actual technical committees, for the first time in the history of Afghanistan, we had women participated. So we had a constitutional drafting committee where 2 out of 9 were women. We had a Constitutional Review Committee, where 9 out of 35 were women. And then the Loya Jirga, which is our constituent assembly that approved the Constitution, had roughly 20% of its members as women. And they were elected from the districts. So what that tells us, first of all, is that women were not just recipients of the Constitution and the rights that are outlined in the Constitution. They actually were part of it. They were part of the process. They were part of the design. And that's an important aspect to be kept in mind, particularly when we're talking or we're negotiating the Constitution or constitutional rights and values with the Taliban. The Constitution, as Saburi already mentioned, outlines a comprehensive set of rights and liberties. And again, this has been unprecedented in Afghanistan. And when it comes to women's rights, a few aspects are extremely important. First, it's equality before the law and equality of men and women before the law, and equality of Muslims and non-Muslims. That makes it a very open constitution, not just for Afghanistan, but even in comparison to many Islamic countries. Particularly with regards to women, the Constitution recognizes their equality with men, their equality before the law, ensures that or upholds their right to education, and that as well was particularly looking at how they were deprived of such rights during the Taliban. Following that, their right to political participation, which are the examples of are within the parliament, also running for public offices. There's no restriction for women to become judges in the Constitution of Afghanistan. They can run for any political office as well as for judiciary. Protection of family has also been given significant importance in the Constitution. And all of that tell us that the Constitution, particularly given the history women suffering in the country had paid attention, and not to forget that women were part of this whole process. It has definitely impacted policies afterwards. So now that we see women and the number of women in education, in higher education, is extremely impressive as compared to the decades before this constitution. Their political participation has been very vibrant, and they have not only participated politically or have been part of the, or have held political office, but they've been very active in it, and they have proven themselves. That is not the fact that they've just been given quotas, but rather they deserve it, and they have done their best in those positions. But then you look at the other side. You look at the fact that what is at risk when it comes to these rights in part of the peace process, or how the Taliban have historically and recently viewed the rights of women. In practice, we have all seen, I think the world has witnessed how Taliban had treated women in their regime. So our fears, the fears that we Afghan women have, it doesn't only stem from the fact that Taliban are an opposition group or a terrorist group, but it actually stems from the fact that we have experienced them, we have lived under them, and we have seen what they have done to women during their regime. But it's interesting to know that in terms of their views in writing, it's important to know that the Taliban had a constitution back in 1998, and then reviewed and reapproved in 2005. And in that constitution, you see that the role of women is completely missing. There's the term woman or zan has not been used in that constitution at all, including the parts where they make hijab mandatory. Even at that part, it's not, the term woman is not mentioned. So that, of course, confirms what they had, the way they had treated women during the regime, or how they see women within a polity or within a political system. In their constitution, many positions are specific to men. That includes the Amir, that includes the head of the government. The way the criteria is set out for the members of the Islamic Council, which is supposedly their parliament, that as well completely excludes women. So these are just a few examples that you see Afghan women where they have come in the last 15, 16 years after the approval of the current constitution, and how they might be at risk when we talk about the Taliban, and how they may treat women if they're given a chance to rewrite the constitution or to hold political power. Women's rights have not just been protected under the Constitution of Afghanistan, but also at the international level, and to many of the treaties to which Afghanistan is a party. And the Constitution of Afghanistan respects the observance of these international treaties to which it's a party. But unfortunately, this is not one area where we have had a lot of progress in the past couple of years. Although, as for our obligations under CEDAW, for example, we have certain laws passed in the country, particularly the law on elimination of violence against women, and also the law on anti-harassment. But overall, Afghanistan needs to do more of its homework and needs to work more in terms of reflecting the international laws and international treaties into its legal and judicial systems. Because just signing treaties and passing the laws, of course, there are important steps towards the application of international laws and fulfilling our obligations. But overall, one also has to see how these international laws fully get implemented and provide that level of protection to women that is required. I'm saying that because under Article 121 of the Constitution of Afghanistan, all international treaties and covenants have to be in compliance with the Constitution. So as a dualist country, we give superiority to our Constitution as compared to international law, and that in the long term can also have its impacts on the issue. Then I would also want to briefly talk about the fact that when we talk about how the Taliban see women and their role, it is important for us to keep in mind that the current constitution ensures inclusivity and pluralism as the foundations of the constitution. But then, as I discussed already, that's not necessarily the case with the one of the Taliban. What is important for us here is to see how the Taliban see the current constitution of Afghanistan as not being Islamic, or as being Western, or as they label it, the constitution of the administration of Afghanistan. I think, first of all, it's important to see that this is the constitution of the people of Afghanistan. The constitution has made the administration, or the administration is made on the basis of the constitution, not the other way around. It's not the administration that has made the constitution. And then when you look at for example, if you look at when the Taliban talk about these issues, of course, they're never explicit, they're never clear or detailed, they always talk general and vague, but still you see that they talk about equality, they talk about women's rights, they talk about human rights, they talk about governance, but they're never clear about it. Now, if in general they believe with these theories and ideas, then why not just sit down and look at the current constitution, or as I advised them previously and still do, they should read the Constitution of Afghanistan to understand what is in that constitution that goes against or against their beliefs. I think what's important to keep in mind is that the current constitution of Afghanistan, we believe it's the best constitution Afghanistan has experienced, but that does not mean it's perfect. And I don't believe any constitution around the world is a perfect constitution. All constitutions are living documents and they improve over time. And we have to give it that chance to improve over time. There are amendment mechanisms within the constitution. The constitution can be amended. And we propose, Afghan women have constantly said that we want the constitution to remain as it is. And even if it's amended, it has to be amended through the channel specified in the constitution. That's the best thing about the amendment mechanism in the constitution is that it protects fundamental rights. So it says if fundamental rights are to be amended, they can only be amended in order to be improved. And that is the kind of protection we need. Again, I would like to repeat that our concerns with regards to the Taliban is not just because what we see as a terrorist group fighting the government, but as a group that we have experienced and we have lived under, and therefore Afghan women have a lot of fears, and we're hoping that their rights and their liberties and their achievements and gains of the past 18 years are protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was important for us to hear these thoughts, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So please put them in the chat to me. I know I have a lot of questions about consent and legitimacy. Palwasha Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you to McGill University, and thank you to Women Living Under Muslim Law for allowing me the opportunity to speak on these issues. I'm just going to pull up the page so that I can see my slides as I'm sharing them with you. And thank you so much to my colleagues, to Hamid Saburi and to Ghizaal Haress for really setting the stage for the presentation that I'm about to give. There's a number of things that I heard in the presentations that you gave. One is the first constitution of Afghanistan, 1923, lays out a lot of these articles related to women's rights, which is very true, but I think we need to also recognize that Amanullah Khan and that constitution was a problem, and there was a revolt against him. So it's important to recognize that piece of history as well. And there's a number of assumptions that I'd also like to challenge at some point, particularly that this has been a double-edged sword in terms of women's rights, because you know, from the historical critical analysis that I've done of Afghanistan, women have been in leadership positions various times, both through history and at local governance, and also women in the parliament right now, the National Assembly, the upper and lower house. I think it'd be interesting to hear Professor Ghizaal Haress's take also on the implementation, whether it's a minimum or a maximum, and how that's actually been implemented currently in terms of the quota system. But what we have seen is that women who are in parliament currently, all the figures show, on average, they have higher education than men, they attend more sessions than men, and by that, they also pass more laws than men. So, so those are some of the things I just wanted to add to the conversation here. As we look. But what I'll look at quickly is a general comparison between the Islamic Constitution and the Islamic Emirate draft Constitution that Ghizaal Haress also mentioned and talked about, a comparison of constitutional articles related to women's rights, and what really are those key essential articles that are important to women's rights that we see throughout other constitutions in the Muslim world. So just very quickly, I'll review some of the constitutional differences. And this again is the current Islamic Republic of Afghanistan Constitution of 2004. And I'm comparing it to the draft version of the Islamic Emirate Constitution, or Dastur that they called it, of 2005, which in some ways was a response to the 2004 Constitution and their edits. So both uphold Islam to be the state religion. I want to state right off the bat that the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan 2004 Constitution currently is one of the most Islamic constitutions in the world. And part of that is because not only is it an Islamic republic, also that it is a state religion, but also it says that no laws can go against Islamic provisions. So both of them have this provision about laws according to Islam, both the Islamic Republic and this Taliban draft constitution. But the difference is in that the current Islamic Republic says that no laws can go against the provision of Islam, which is called the repugnancy clause, whereas the Taliban say that Sharia should be the only source of law, or sole source clause. For the Taliban, Hanafi jurisprudence is the main source, whereas Hanafi jurisprudence in the Islamic Republic Constitution is a source where there are no existing laws in the Islamic Republic Constitution. So that's a big difference. In terms of sovereignty, the Taliban claim that sovereignty is only with God in their Article 2. In the Islamic Republic, Article 4 states that national sovereignty is with the people. It's not necessarily a contradiction. We can see in the Pakistan Constitution that they actually have both these in the way that they articulate it in the Constitution, saying that the sovereignty belongs, whereas the sovereignty over the entire universe belongs to Almighty Allah alone, the authority can be exercised by the people of Pakistan within the limits prescribed by him as a sacred trust. So these two aren't necessarily a contradiction, although they have been presented that way in some of the conversations. But the Pakistan Constitution is an example of how both are included. If we look, Jamhuriyat is the word for republic. If we look at the Jamhuriyat versus the emirate, and on issues of Islamic governance or Islami Nizam, which often comes up in the peace talks, they both say we agree on Islami Nizam, but we have this difference. So what is exactly Islami Nizam? And we look through history, we can say that through Bay'ah, the head of state is elected. There's different forms that Bay'ah takes a role, different types of electoral mechanisms, but basically the head of state is elected. In the Islamic Republic, the president is elected by the people. In the Taliban constitution, the emir has to be chosen by this Islamic Shura, but the Shura itself is appointed by the emir, so confusing there. Another is the head of state shura is made up of leaders recognized by the people. And we have, of course, I said the Taliban choose the emir. The judiciary is independent in the Islamic Republic. And in the Taliban, it's a little bit different. They're appointed again, removed by the emir. When we get to women's issues, in the Islamic Nizam, we have examples throughout history, even from the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, where women participate in the elections. Women can be in the shuras and judges according to Hanafi jurisprudence. In the Islamic Republic, again, same. However, in the Islamic Emirate, that's not the case. Women are not allowed to hold political positions, nor can they be head of state or judges. And basically, as Ghizaal mentioned, the hijab is this institution to be upheld as outlined in the Constitution. And then we have this issue on minority rights. And minority rights are protected to practice their religion and have equal citizenship rights in the Islamic Republic. And there's no reference to minority rights actually in the Taliban's draft constitution. So from my study of all of the different Muslim countries and their constitutions around the world, the articles that we've found that have been very essential to upholding women's rights, especially where there is a reference to Islamic law or Sharia in the Constitution, are these four: the equal citizenship rights, women's rights to work with special provisions to protect the right to work, equal access to education and healthcare, and equal rights to political participation and representation. So I'm going to take a look more in depth about comparing the two, Islamic Republic and the Islamic Emirate, and then also bring in examples from other constitutions around the world. So on the equal citizenship rights, Islamic Republic, women fought really hard to get this language in Article 22, that the citizens of Afghanistan, including men and women, have equal rights and duties before the law. In the Islamic Emirate, it just says all people of Afghanistan. It does say without any discrimination have equal rights and duties, but it gives this taking into consideration the Islamic provisions. So of course, we know their interpretation of Islamic provisions is very different than the interpretation that the rest of Afghanistan held. So we have the equal citizenship rights in other Muslim countries. In Egypt, similarly, they have men and women specifically articulated in their Article 11. They also have the issue of discrimination, no discrimination, basis of religion, belief, and sex. So those are two that uphold this equal citizenship issue. In Oman, again, this no discrimination on the grounds of gender is emphasized, and in Algeria, similarly as well. On the issue, let's see, we have the Islamic Republic of Iran on equal citizenship rights, the rights of women. The government must secure the rights of women in all respects according to Islamic criteria. Again, we have that Islamic criteria there. In the Tunisian Republic, we have, again, male and female specifically mentioned when all citizens are mentioned. In the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, all citizens are equal protections of the law, and then no discrimination on the basis of sex. So those are some things to highlight there. In terms of women's rights to work, the Islamic Republic says the work is the right of every Afghan, no specific clause related to women there. But in Article 54, there's a specific reference to attain physical and spiritual health of the family, especially of the child and mother. So there's a adopting of measures. And in my conversations, and I would be grateful to hear from Professor Ghizaal Haress on her take of this, but in my conversations with some parliamentarians, they've said that this is one of the clauses that has been used to advocate for maternity leave and to ensure that there are daycares provided for women at places of work. So this has actually been used positively to create more openness or more provisions to protect women's rights to work. In the Islamic Emirate, work is the right of every Afghan citizen. There's not specific about women. In terms of the way family is described, it's very much about regulating the provisions and according to Islamic rights and ethics. So it's a whole different approach to understanding and reinforcing family ties. In other Muslim countries, we had this conversation with Egyptians as well. They said that this article has been both a double-edged sword, can be protecting women's rights and can also hurt them when there's duties towards her family and work requirements. The reconciliation issue on rights to work can be used both ways. In Tunisia, I think it's one of the most progressive here is the work to right for every citizen, male and female. It is included and then the rights to decent working conditions and whatnot. So let me try and, I know my time is limited here, so I'm going to try and scroll through quickly. We have on the right to education, specifically promoting education for women in the Islamic Republic. Article 44 is stated in the Islamic Emirate. There's the education of women is regulated within the limits of Islamic Sharia and by special law. So you can see a very different approach to education. One is being regulated, one is promoting. On Egyptian constitution, every citizen has the right to education, and on. Similarly, it's written. In political rights, I won't go into this in detail because Professor Saburi also mentioned the Islamic Republic quotas. Other Islamic countries have quotas, also have measures to ensure appropriate representation, as in Egypt. In Tunisia, they also have measures to guarantee women's representation in elected bodies. And so we can see that from other Muslim countries, there's similar provisions that but the Islamic Republic really takes it further and really specifying women's political rights in different ways. So just to sum up the key findings in the constitutional comparison between the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Emirate draft constitution, there are different conceptions of sovereignty. Both constitutions are explicitly Islamic, but rely upon Sharia very differently. There's different conceptions of the executive power. There's both constitutions include a legislator, but with different selection methods and roles for sure. There's some version of judicial independence, but women are not allowed to be judges in the Taliban system. And there are differences on who has the authority to interpret the constitution. Citizens' rights are treated very differently in both, and women's rights are regulated very closely in the Taliban draft, both according to provisions of Islam, but also in terms of family and regulating the family as an institution and upholding the hijab as an institution. And finally, it's very interesting to note that the Taliban constitution lacks any reference to a loya jirga, which is a very traditional role in Afghanistan. So thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with the questions.
Thank you very much, Palwasha Jan. That was very interesting to see it all set out and compared each provision by provision. So I have one question that I would like to pose to all three speakers, and I'm still waiting for more questions. So could you please type your questions into the chat? So my question that I would like to start with is to ask, what kind of mechanisms do you think would be necessary in order to enforce or to enhance the legitimacy of the current constitution and to fight off challenges of a counter constitution drafting by the Taliban? What are the chances? So if we can just go in the order of speakers, if each of you could perhaps give a short response, that would be fantastic. Hamid, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted Ms. Kakar or Ms. Ghizaal if they wanted to.
Yes, please. You decide.
First, but that's okay. I think it's a very complicated but also timely question because we already have a constitution. What we don't know from the Taliban side, all we know is their views, and we know their views based on what they have done in the past 20 years, and also during their rule between 1996 and 2001, and how radical their views are, particularly when it comes to women's rights. I think if the enforcing mechanisms are itself the provisions of the Constitution, if those are implemented equally and justly across the country, and if there's the authority to basically enforce them across the country, and for that, I think what we need is not only the political willingness, but also the ground that is ready to accept and the provision, and also the judiciary that's accountable, and the system that's accountable too. And I think with what's happening right now with the peace talks, and we are not sure where those talks are heading and what the outcome of those talks would be. I think one of the issues that's going to be in line, it is going to be the provisions of the Constitution, and particularly the human rights of women in Afghanistan. Once again, to just answer this quickly, I think there are enforcing mechanisms within the Constitution of Afghanistan, but I think what didn't really happen in the past 20 years, the situation on the ground was not suited enough to basically implement those provisions in a just and more inclusive manner. So I think once the ground realities are changed, I think once we do have some stability across the country, I think that could be achieved throughout the country, and I think those mechanisms are within the provisions of the Constitution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Verinda. I think that's a very important question. I think, to me, the way to keep the enforcing mechanisms under the current constitution going, the most important thing would be the support and willingness from our international allies, particularly from the United States, because they've been leading this process. About 10 days to 2 weeks ago, there was a leaked proposal, peace government proposal from the United States, in which they were pushing for a new constitution. And that is when you see that one questions whether the threat is only from the side of the Taliban. Yes, of course there is, but then the question is how the international community, international allies are going to protect the gains of the last 18 years, and not to forget that they invested so much in what we have as our gains today. And we as Afghans, we invested so much. Maybe we did not invest financially, but we invested in so many other ways. And in today's Afghanistan is not the same as Afghanistan of 2001. Even if we do go for a new constitution for let's say as a part of the peace process, or in order to ensure peace in Afghanistan, the major question would be, what are the risks of having a new constitution? Whether we're talking substantively, whether we're talking procedurally. Substance, can we really protect, or can we really bring in the same level of substance into the constitution? Procedurally, can we really guarantee particularly if you're talking about women's rights, can we really guarantee the same level of participation of women in the process, be it the drafting, the review, or the approval mechanism of the Constitution? Also, the current Constitution, another unique thing about it is that, except for the Taliban, there is no political group in the country that does not respect or accept the Constitution. Every political group in the country has accepted and respected the Constitution, and even if they have run for public offices, they have gone through the channels specified in the Constitution. The question would be, if the process or the procedure for bringing a new constitution is not going to be similar as the previous one, because the previous one had the unprecedented level of public participation in Afghanistan, then the question would be, what would be the level of acceptance of that constitution? So I think the international community could use its leverage. I think the United States should think about what they have invested in Afghanistan and what is at loss here. It's not just their own investment, but also the gains and the blood that was shed for millions of Afghans, or at least hundreds and thousands of Afghans who fought for a society or for a day or for a constitution like this.
Thank you for that response, Ghizaal, and I'll just pass to Palwasha Jan for her thoughts on this question.
Yeah, just very quickly. I totally agree. I think it has to start with international pressure, because there somehow is this expectation now that the Taliban will be getting somehow a new constitution out of this deal. And so it starts with the international pressure and really limiting the expectation and making it very clear what the process is and what the expectation is on the Taliban in this peace process. So that needs to be made clear. I think in terms of the internal enforcement of this constitution in Afghanistan, and Ghizaal can speak to this much better than me, I think that there is a need to tighten some pieces of interpretation of the Constitution to make it very clear in terms of how the Constitution should be interpreted, particularly as it relates to Sharia, as it relates to Islamic law, and who is the interpreter of Islamic law, and how that is done to prevent loopholes and to make it very clear in terms of what the standards are and the expectations are in terms of how the role of the Constitution and the interpretation of the law. The other things that I would like to mention is that on the implementation side of the Constitution, there are a number of provisions, I think, that that have been raised into question in terms of with this proposal that Ghizaal had mentioned, with the role of the Ulama and what is the role of the Ulama. And I think that needs to be perhaps clarified. Not that it isn't already in the current Constitution. I think in the current setup, there are ways that the Ulama are involved. There is a Dar al-Ifta that makes recommendations to the Supreme Court, and there is a National Ulama Council already in Afghanistan, but maybe there could be clarifications. But what needs to be said very clearly is that those are kinds of amendments that can be made to the Constitution rather than a whole new Constitution being adopted here. And so I think that needs to be, that kind of information needs to be communicated clearly, and expectations need to be managed in the peace process.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are very interesting answers to see how we can entrench women's rights within the potential of the Constitution. And I think that I would just like to re-emphasize the point that the 2004 Constitution was crafted as a result of tremendous public consultation, and has the legitimacy and also the approval of the ulama. So I think that's a very important point to understand. And that brings me to the next question. I'll just quickly scroll in my chat to make sure that I ask the question in the correct way. One question is with regard to the institution of hijab and how it's understood by the Taliban. So I'll leave it to you. You can, whoever would like to answer, please. Palwasha, perhaps you could have a stab at that answer.
Well, I think that the way it is described is in the draft constitution is that the hijab should be upheld by the government. So it's a really strange concept. I have not seen this in other constitutions, and you know, the interpretation of the hijab is something that comes under question. By this, do they mean a limitation, just, you know, the physical scarf on a woman's head? Do they mean the covering over the face? Do they mean mobility of women as an institution that the government should track and should prevent? I mean, there's so many levels that this could be interpreted, and it's not clear from my reading of the Constitution. I don't know, Ghizaal, if you have a sense of what that means, but also in terms of how they've implemented it in the past, what that might mean. And also Saboory side, maybe you have some ideas, but Ghizaal, I think perhaps maybe you would know better.
Well, that's a difficult question, because when you look at their practice, so of course the wording on the Constitution is very vague. I call it the Constitution, not draft Constitution, because the documents I've seen and read says that the Constitution went to an assembly twice and was endorsed. So I just call it the Constitution. There, the text is very vague, and as I said, the audience of it is not very specific. Or is it women, or is it the whole people, or is it the fact that the government has to enforce it? Who do they enforce it on? But then going back to what they practiced during their period was that women had to fully cover their faces. They had to wear socks so that their feet would not appear. The hands could not appear below, what do you call it? Running out of English word. Wrist. Thank you. Thank you so much. So the hands cannot be shown below that. If women are wearing nail polish, they would be lashed. So I think the practice has shown a very, very extreme application of hijab. And the fact that even if a woman has all of these observed, then still she cannot be walking around without a male companion, and they have been lashed publicly. I was not living in Afghanistan during the Taliban period, but of course there have been a lot of research done and a lot of writings on this subject. Yes, I think the institution of hijab. One more thing, I was speaking to one of the members of the piece of Afghanistan's delegation, the negotiators, and the delegate was telling me how when women talk, the 4 women we have as a part of the delegation, when they talk, how some members of the Taliban actually try not to look at them, so they don't make eye contact. I heard a specific case where one of the members of the Taliban delegation actually starts to look down, like really down, and then starts to say something or whisper something. That is probably to just whisper something so that he cannot hear what women say. Some of them have been respectful, from what I hear from Doha, to women, but they wouldn't sit down with them. They wouldn't really start a conversation with them. So looking at what happened during the regime and looking at how they have been dealing with women right now, I think the conservative perspective they have on hijab, I think, is still the same thing, that face should be fully covered, clothes should not be very visible, feet should not be visible. I think I would assume that all of that, as per what we see, is still there.
I'll just take a quick shot at that. It's because unlike Ghizaal and Palwasha, I lived under the Taliban, so I've seen how their interpretation of hijab and women's rights and how they should be outside in a social environment, how they should be. I think it hasn't changed. I think it's very radical. And if, like Ghizaal said, I have a number of good friends who are part of the negotiating team, and they have been telling me that they haven't changed, and their attitude is as they are. They were ruling the country back in 1996, and I don't think so it will change. But what has changed, and I think they haven't realized this in Afghanistan after 2001, is all this the people who have changed dramatically, and it's the education, it's what they have enjoyed, living in a society, working, going to work within the country, outside the country, teaching, and all other things that they have enjoyed in the past 20 years, and I think which is sort of alien to them. But I think their ideology has not changed. I guess it won't be changed. So that's what concerns me the most. And I think, and when I was saying before that, one is that we do have guarantees in the Constitution, but in practice, how it's going to be implemented within the society, particularly if there is some kind of deal between the Taliban and the Afghan government, whether agreed or imposed, which we have to see how it develops, is going to have a radical impact on women's rights. And the hijab, and I think, and I'll finish here. Their interpretation of hijab is an entire full coverage of a woman, like wearing exactly the burqa that we're wearing back in the 1996, and it was imposed on women, and I think that has not changed at all.
Thank you for that. Those are the rather chilling answers that we have to consider. And we see, of course, that the Taliban ideology has not changed. So I think it is a challenge to figure out what can be leveraged. And I hear the answers about the role of the international allies and friends. So I thank you for those responses. I'm just reading another answer a question I have in the chat from one of our participants. And the question is, do women in Afghanistan have equal access to law education?
I think you would.
That's legal education?
Yes, legal education. Do women in Afghanistan have equal access to legal education?
Mm-hmm. As per the laws of the country and the constitution, they have equal rights to access to education. But of course, because of the periods of war in most of the rural areas of Afghanistan, women have had issues of accessing education and having access to school education. And that, of course, is a hindrance towards their legal education as the higher level of education. But in the cities, of course, where women have had access to primary education and then higher education, then yes, there is no restriction as such. The restrictions have just been social restrictions, or at times lack of schools, or in the past there were also issues of not having universities in the provinces. But right now in Afghanistan, in all the 34 provinces of Afghanistan, we do have universities, and women have equal access to it. But of course, one cannot rule out the social issues, social restrictions that are still there, and maybe a hindrance to women's access to legal education.
Okay, thank you for that. I have another question, and that is a more technical constitutional question, and I'll open it to all three speakers if they could answer. And that is, what are the mechanisms to include the international treaties into Afghan laws? And we saw from Palwasha Jan's slide that you have the repugnancy clause and the source, no, sole source clause, but this is a question from one of the, go ahead, please.
You want to go ahead, Palwasha John, or you want me to go ahead? The Constitution, when it comes to the international treaties and international law, we have Article 7 that says the government of Afghanistan observes and respects its obligations to all international treaties. And then we have one of the powers of the parliament, I can't recall what article, but it's one of the powers of the parliament to approve the international treaties. And of course, that is basically the process of accession to any international treaty in almost any country. But the term that's used in the article of the Constitution, if I'm not wrong, it's
on so I can have the audio.
I'm sorry.
Okay. If you could just mute your mic, go ahead, Ghizaal.
Okay, so yes, the terminology that is used, for example, for the laws, we have used the term approve the laws, which in Dari it says ta'id or manzur. And then the term used for international treaties is sort of confirm or verify or attest. It's slightly different language. And in Dari, the term tasdiq has been used as the power of the parliament with regards to international laws and treaties. Now, with that, the parliament's understanding of this article is that when international treaties or conventions, when the government signs them and then sends them for accession to the parliament can either fully accept it or fully reject it. They cannot have any sort of observations or anything, which I think is not which I think is a common practice, because parliaments, the negotiation is usually done by the governments. Then we have Article 121 that says the Supreme Court can have, the Supreme Court has the power to review international treaties and international covenants for its compliance with the Constitution. And the referral power has been given either to the government or to the lower courts. Now that is through the Constitution. These are the three steps that international treaties go through. We also have a statutory law on the mechanisms for approval of the international treaties and conventions. And as per that statutory law, once Afghanistan signs a convention, then it has to approve statutory laws duly in accordance to those conventions as well. We have had some success with regards to that. For example, we have the Elimination of Violence Against Women, CEDAW, and we have also approved a law within the country, although it has been very controversial because the parliament has not signed that law, approved the law yet, but is still valid, constitutionally valid, because the president has approved it. We also have another example of United Nations Convention Against Corruption, the UNCAC. And for that as well, we have an anti-corruption law on the basis of that convention. But there are so many other aspects for which we do not necessarily have a law. We also have a statutory law on prohibition of torture, for example. So in terms of the process, that is what the process is. In terms of the application, then unfortunately, unless we have a statutory law for an aspect, the judges in Afghanistan do not apply international law as a source. Neither do we consider much of the international law as a source of law when we make the law, because we may, but then Article 3 in the repugnancy clause comes in there. So we do have some challenges, and that's why previously I was saying that we still have to do a lot of homework in terms of how do we run the process smoothly, how are we going to reflect our international obligations into our statutory laws, and then how do we ensure their application in the courts. But overall, that's how the process is, at least on paper.
Yeah, just quickly to add, I think it's the executive that negotiates those laws or provisions, and then it's the parliament that has to ratify it, and the judiciary then, once it's ratified, then one directly or indirectly it's embedded within the laws of Afghanistan, and then the judiciary has to implement it. Implementation in a manner that they don't make the law, but once the laws are created and drafted, it's being ensured. They have to ensure that those treaties or agreements or laws that Afghanistan is a party to and is party completely, without any with the exception of if we have any reservation, or I think we do have the right to have reservations like other countries to any charter or treaty or convention that Afghanistan becomes a party, then the laws that we are drafting should be in conformity to those laws. But like as I'll say, we do have some problems in terms of including those laws, and also after that implementing certain laws which should be in conformity to the laws and agreements that we have been a party to. And I think this is the part where we did have we have experienced problems in the past. And also it goes back to the knowledge of our legislators, whether they are aware of certain international treaties and conventions that Afghanistan is a party, which I think we did have that problem in the past, and I guess it should still exist.
Thank you very much for your responses. We're getting close to the end of our time, so I will ask one last question that I've received in the chat. I'll try to make the question short, and I would ask for a short response so that we respect the time of our esteemed guests. The question is from Najib of the Afghan Institute of Learning, and the question is, why does the present constitution of Afghanistan not have any article which respects women's rights, nor in the Taliban regime? So I'm not sure if we could just take it as, are there any articles in the constitution that respect women's rights? I'll paraphrase the question.
I think, if I may, I think this was discussed by all the three of us, that yes, there are many provisions in the Constitution of Afghanistan that both protect and uphold the right of women, their equality, their political participation, the right to education, and many others. So I think a general answer to that would be yes.
Thank you very much. So I think I'll take the opportunity to thank the speakers and to share these thoughts, and I will pass it over to Kimia to give the vote of thanks, please. So Kimia, it's all yours.
All right, so on behalf of the McGill Centre for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, as well as the Women Living Under Muslim Laws Solidarity Network, I would like to extend a sincere thank you to each of our distinguished speakers, including Ms. Ghizaal Haress, Ms. Palwasha Kakar, and Mr. Hamid Saburi. Thank you for taking time today to share your knowledge and experience with us, and for enriching our critical engagement on the intersection between women's rights, constitutional law, and Muslim law within the context of Afghanistan. Thank you as well to Professor Homa Hoodfar for offering insightful words of introduction and for providing some historical context about the campaign, as well as to Professor Vrinda Narain for moderating the discussion, as well as the Q&A portion. So to stay connected with the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, feel free to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. The link is for both is at McGill CHRLP, and I will also input that in the chat as well for your reference. We hope to see you at our future events, and our next joint webinar series will be next week on March 31st at 10 a.m. Eastern. Questions may also be submitted in advance to chrlp.law@mcgill.ca. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance and participation today.
Thank you, Kimia. So we're going to sign off and leave the meeting. Thank you to the audience for participating as well. Thank you.